Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Marley Givens and I am hosting the meeting today on behalf of the Georgia Libraries Conference. I would just like to give you a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, everyone who has been admitted to the meeting is on mute. Your video is muted and your audio is muted. And we'll be taking questions through the chat. So make sure that you can find the link to the chat in your Zoom screen, and feel free to send questions, which I will be taking on behalf of our presenters. Zoom also lets you raise your hand. There's a raise hand feature. And so if you want to make sure that we notice that you have a question, you can raise your hand. The Georgia Library Association does have a code of conduct. GLA is strongly committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and the free expression of ideas. And at the GLA conference and other GLA events, you agree to respect the boundaries of other attendees and look out for one another. And I have a link to the full code of conduct and community agreements in the chat. So feel free to click on that if you'd like to read it. This session, including the chat, is being recorded. And so I'm going to start my hosting duties in terms of managing the participants. So feel free to chat any issues that you might be having, chat your questions. And I'm going to turn everything over now to our two presenters who are coming to us from Georgia Southern University. This is Nikki Cannon-Rech and Autumn Johnson.
Apologies, everyone.
All right, you got it on?
Okay.
Woohoo, yay! I love technology. Okay,
And we can hear you and we can see your presentation, so take it away.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Nikki Cannon-Rech, and I'm one of the Research Services Librarians at Georgia Southern University. I'm also the liaison to the College of Science and Mathematics, so I typically deal with my natural science faculty and students.
And my name is Autumn Johnson. My title is Special Collections Librarian, but I also work within the Research Services Unit at Georgia Southern University. So I do traditional research services work, especially with my liaison area of history, theater, and apparel design.
Our presentation today is called About Face Design, and we're specifically going to be discussing instructional programming. So not just your traditional one-shot or regular information literacy sessions, but those kind of special programming sessions that you use to teach your students some things about library resources and research without them realizing they're being taught.
Specifically, we hope by the end of this presentation that you'll begin to understand the important role virtual programming can have in a library's reopening plan, that you recognize the value LibGuides, LibWizard, and the entire SpringShare suite can have as platforms for those virtual programs. And we hope that you can take away from this beginning understanding or beginning of a development of a plan for designing a virtual instructional program, such as an escape experience that can facilitate authentic learning and engagement with your patrons. So of course, COVID is what brings us here today. As COVID-19 forced libraries nationwide to close their physical spaces, librarians and library workers from all different types of libraries worked diligently to assure patrons that service could and would be delivered through alternative means. As libraries slowly began to reopen our spaces, one service that really seemed to be elusive to this new normal. I know we don't really like the phrase, to the new normal of social distancing, and the extra precautions that we were starting to take is programming. But programming is an essential function of all of our libraries. It generates awareness of our library, our resources, our services. It provides an opportunity for learning and an often collaborative environment. And with social engagement greatly impacted by social distancing and other safety measures, it serves a critically important purpose to our patrons' well-being, their mental well-being during this time. And it's certainly an escape, pun intended, from everything happening outside of our library work.
Yes, as my colleague mentioned, I think COVID has forced all of us to take an about face on a lot of what we offer and the way we offer our patrons these services. Many of you probably thought of the military definition of about face when you first saw this, but what really drew us to this were those middle two definitions where it talks about a change of direction or a complete change of direction, opinion, or way of acting. And I think that's what COVID has forced us all to do. It has forced us to change our directions and think of things in new ways, or change our opinion about the way certain things are presented, designed. A background on Georgia Southern and our escape game programming. We've been doing escape games for a little over 2 years now, building them on the success of commercial escape games. And if you're familiar with them at all, you'll know that the big commercial escape games can run anywhere from $25 to $50 plus per person. They've been very popular the last few years before COVID hit, obviously. Many of them have not been able to run in the way they normally did once COVID hit. And a lot of libraries started picking up on this trend, especially our public libraries. They're probably the ones that kind of led the charge in this. And then a few academic libraries started jumping on board as well. Especially for the public libraries, a lot of these games were simply fun events, kind of extracurricular. But soon, instructional librarians in the academic institutions began to discover that, hey, this really is a fun and unique way to introduce our patrons to some of the skill sets that we want them to learn, to help them work through some of those mundane tasks of kind of learning to search a database and develop keywords and connect resources to ideas. And it's a way that gets students very hands-on and kind of together. There's a lot of professional literature about this that's been published in the last few years. There's been an increase in the discussion of game-based instruction and gamification as a legitimate way of learning. And ALA notes it as one of the hottest trends in libraries. So a lot has been going on with this. Our first one, based on a musician that was here in Statesboro in the 1920s, Blind Willie, was basically aimed at our freshman year experience students, and a way to get them in and kind of create a fun, hands-on way to be introduced to the library and the basic concepts of research without us standing in front of them kind of lecturing and walking them through our databases. The room was designed with kind of a student study room theme in the library, so it was something they could relate to. The storyline went that they were students working on a research paper and they couldn't find the variety of sources they needed. So that's what started us off. Very simple, very low key, very inexpensive. I think the entire game pretty much cost us less than $25 because we basically pilfered materials from around the library and a few things from our own home. Later that year, we celebrated 100 years of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we added an escape game to that month-long level of programming. And it was a little more fun-oriented, not as much lesson-oriented, We basically wanted to offer a fun way for the students to interact with some of their liaison librarians without the overhang of that kind of formal class setting. That led to even more. Our Under the Big Top and Secret Sources and Swamps are two very distinct games that we're going to talk about a little bit in more detail. I'm going to start with Under the Big Top. This was an interesting game in that it really originally took us out of our traditional format for a game. With all of the others, we had built them kind of in the room we had available. It was limiting to the number of students we could have go through there. Our general goal was to have between 4 to 8 students max on a team going through these games. With these particular groups, our McNair scholars and then our summer REU students that were coming in for scientific research. We do some instruction for those students within the library, and their faculty wanted us touching on ethics in research. They wanted to do it in a way that was engaging and got the students involved. So we started thinking about an escape room, but we didn't have the time period where we could break it down over a month-long period and have small groups of people come in for the games. So we had to design a game that could handle a large population at once. This game ran 70-something students through it at one time. We designed it around the circus theme. We had at least 6 different rings that they would go to, and the students worked in small groups traveling from station to station in order to work through those ethical dilemmas that often come up in research.
Another one of our escape rooms that we did was Secret Sources and Swamp a few months later. And we took the lessons learned from the escape scenarios and those that we had designed over the previous year, and we designed a completely immersive room. So last year's program, which coincided with Georgia Archives Month, was probably the most commercial-like escape program that we'd offered to date. It was a little different in the fact that we incorporated our special collections or our archival collections, and we had students examine historical evidence and solve puzzles in order to complete the objective. And the objective, of course, was based off of a skill set built on the primary source literacy outcomes targeted by the SAA, the Society of American Archivists, and ACRL. Last year's program greatly increased awareness of our archival collections throughout the university community, and it became a catalyst for collaboration between myself, the special collections librarian, subject librarians like Nikki and STEM, and teaching faculty. In all, I believe we had over 120 students and 23 faculty representing a variety of majors and departments, including education, English, biology, chemistry, of course, history, that participated in the hour-long experience, which only ran for a week. And it was by far one of our most successful instructional programs to date. Now, we incorporated a variety of assessments through each of these games, combining performance assessments in which they were demonstrating mastery of information literacy and primary literacy source skills. We also asked them a couple of evaluative questions and open-ended questions in order to gauge their experience with the instructional programs that we offered. Overwhelming, 100% actually, wanted to see the library continue to offer escape game programs in the future. And so here are 2 open-ended quotes that a faculty member shared. I hope that the library continues to put on these escape rooms that both myself as well as future students can utilize and learn more about Georgia's Southern secrets. We also had an undergrad students and a free response exercise required by their instructor respond with, the event helped to unify a small group of strangers, educate them in a creative and involved way, which kept the group on track, providing a new and innovative teaching strategy to education that may be a better way to learn, more expensive maybe, but better all the same for visual learners like myself. And again, that was a response from an undergraduate student. So these free response assessments that we are able to build into the game allowed us to kind of gauge that. And really what it demonstrated to us is that we needed to continue the program. Why is it necessary to offer this program during COVID? Well, aside from the general reasons that I shared in the beginning about the importance of programming, even during this period of social distancing, we simply can't ignore this level of patron demand. We can't ignore the faculty feedback we've received from multiple disciplines, nor the lack of momentum. Our experience with escape games has generally been over the past 18-month period. So not offering some type of escape game or instructional program experience utilizing these strategies would really kind of cease that momentum that we've built around the community. Escape game programs and instructional programs like these are also a great way that we found to actually introduce our students to abstract concepts and get them to wrap their head around things like information literacy and critical thinking without realizing they're doing it. We discussed earlier before we started that it really was a bait and switch. They're fun, they're programs, they're exciting, but they're also extremely educational, and students demonstrate mastery of important skills through these games. So early in the summer, generally when the research services librarians meet and plan out their semester, we started to discuss how we would approach programming for the fall. Our plans had to be adjusted, of course, to address the uncertainty of the semester, where we even going to have a semester, but we wanted to make sure that we had some sort of plan to make sure that we were moving forward, and albeit a cautious manner. We identified kind of 4 broad steps that we needed in order to engage our normal instructional programming schedule. So our plan was over the summer that we would examine existing digital escape programs, assess would they work here, could we borrow from them, could we do something similar for our community. We wanted to identify the best tools for adapting our current games, like Under the Big Top, which we were continuing to use, as well as future game plans that we had to celebrate things like Georgia Archives Month. We wanted to be able to prioritize collaboration in a safe, socially distanced manner, but we wanted to do so in a way that was still engaging active learning and campus engagement, albeit in a virtual format. And another thing we had our plan to do is assess not only the efficacy of the instructional program like we had done with all of our face-to-face programs, but we wanted to build in some sort of assessment that would measure the efficacy of a virtual program as well.
So one of the first things we started doing, as most libraries and librarians do, is we started looking to see what else was out there and what many of our other colleagues were doing so that we could learn from them. And one of the first virtual escape rooms that kind of caught everyone's eye as we pivoted for COVID was the Hogwarts digital escape room that was created by Sydney. I'm not going to attempt the last name right now, but a youth services librarian at Peters Township Public Library in Pennsylvania. And again, public librarians, programming is such a fundamental part of what they do that it really was no surprise that something like this was coming out of a public library setting. This escape room just really took off at a point where everyone was feeling uncertain. The world seemed topsy-turvy. Things were shutting down right and left. Everyone was yelling about social distancing and what we were going to do. You couldn't go out to a restaurant. You couldn't do other things. Since they have put this out there, over 225,000 users from over 22 countries across the globe have participated in this escape game. This game has been translated into 7 different languages, y'all. It's insane how successful this game has been. And, you know, they did it very simply, honestly, using some forms and images and things of that nature. So we were excited and felt like, okay, this is possibly doable. And then we started to see others coming up. Escape from Mr. Limoncello's library, again, put together by another public library system. The URL is here for you. So we started to notice that a lot of these were having common themes, okay? Library themed, obviously, following popular literature that they knew their students liked to read or were interested in, especially children's literature, general education type games, and of course, pop culture, things like Harry Potter, and we saw several Stranger Things games come across the board and things of that nature. Here is another example for you with Schitt's Creek, and they have 3 different themes on here that you can go through. So it was another one that was really kind of expanding and offering their groups some different ideas, different ways to engage. Most of these have kind of been using the Google form format, so it's a very linear progression from one clue to the next clue. You have to solve this puzzle and get the correct answer before you are progressed on to the next one.
So we began to consider whether this format using Google Forms would translate our face-to-face instructional programs well. As participants, we found Google Forms to be fairly intuitive. We knew where to put in our codes, we knew where to click. And as game creators too, we recognized the value of the easy-to-use platform that we could easily be borrowed from. The fact that it was free and adaptable, certainly pros to using Google Form. However, Google Form had a couple of disadvantages as far as translating our face-to-face instructional programs. For one, it only facilitated, as Nikki said, that linear game structure. So there was no way for our patrons to solve different clues or different puzzles at different times. The types of puzzles were limited. You could only largely engage images or text. There were limited branding opportunities. Google Forms does not allow for a ton of customization. Now, you saw with the Schitt's Creek example and the Limoncello's Library example, they created front web pages to kind of develop a brand around their escape game. But once you got into the Google form, it pretty much looked like all others. And then, of course, there were accessibility issues because there was, you could not alt tag images or video, well, didn't have videos. That we were concerned that not all of our users would be able to engage in the instructional program in the same way they had with our face-to-face. So in brainstorming with Nikki, we decided to look at the SpringShare suite as a possible solution. That's supposed to say solution there. We were actually already utilizing both the LibWizard and LibInsight features in SpringShare. We were using LibWizard for many of our post-game assessments, in particular the post-game assessments that we use with our faculty and staff. And as a department, we utilize LibInsight to track program success. So this is where we were already sharing information with our colleagues about the student learning and the overall attendance of the programs in LibInsight. So we were already using this as we were building face-to-face games. Now, in translating it to a virtual game experience, there was a couple of things that SpringShare allowed us to do that Google Forms simply did not. LibGuides allowed for a bit more customization, which provided us a way to kind of reflect an overall theme of each of the rooms, and we'll kind of discuss that a little bit later, without the need for, of course, a separate website. Again, the Schitt's Creek web virtual escape game is beautifully blended, but it required the need for an entirely separate website and web interface. So we wanted to be able to build something that was an all-in-one stop, and LibGuides provided that. LibGuides also allowed for easier embedding of widgets, which we could utilize audio and video clues. We could share document file types, different types of files, and we can again customize those. It could also facilitate the use of Google Forms as well. And you'll see as we discuss specifically with the big top, as we adapted that to a virtual platform, we did utilize Google Forms at points in LibGuides. And because it was interoperable, it made it a lot easier to adapt some of those techniques our colleagues had already explored.
And as we were in the throes of kind of deciding about this and looking at LibGuides as an option, lo and behold, somebody beat us to the punch, as is often the case in library land. And it came to our attention that somebody actually had designed a virtual escape game using LibWizard and a little bit of LibGuides. This one came from Rachel Valentine of Texas Women's University. If have access to the slides later. The image will bring you to her presentation she presented at Springy Camp. So this is a presentation platform sponsored by SpringShare that creates the LibGuides. And we were able to see firsthand that yes, first this was doable, works pretty well. And some of the other things we talked about, including images and those different type of forms and links and documents were certainly available. Now her game does kind of take, again, some of that linear approach where you're kind of going through step by step, do this first, then do this, then do this. And that may be important to you depending on what you're wanting your students to get out of it. But just so you know, we think it's possible to also pull it out and make it a little bit more organic.
And I will also add that she utilized the tutorial and assessment feature within LibWizard, which facilitated that more linear design. And our solution was actually kind of a remedy of the two. If we are hosted our game on a platform like LibGuides, we can still use the easy functionality of Google Forms while maintaining the nonlinear gameplay our participants had come to expect with any of our instructional programs.
And I will also say that this guide looks like their guides. And if you use LibGuides at all, you know that branding for your university is very important. You get into this and you realize you are on the library site using one of those library guides, especially if you're a student and you've utilized any of the library guides for any other instruction or for citation help or anything of that nature. And there is a reason we bring that up. So how did we go about doing this? How can you go about adapting what you already have, something that you already know has been successful, and turn it into something virtual? Well, the first thing is to determine kind of how you're going to present your concept, or in our case, the story. All of our escape rooms revolve around a story. There's a scenario that you're trying to figure out. There's something happening. There's a reason you are there. So we all know that students probably are not going to read just a ton of text. We don't want to make these overly texty. Under the big top, a lot of information was presented by our ringmaster, who was another librarian that kind of verbally presented these things. So there's the thought of, you know, can we do this simply by using a video? Recordings, maybe create a comic strip in something like Powtoons and present it that way. Some sort of more interactive way, utilizing some audio as well as the visual so that they're not just having to read huge chunks of text. The manipulatives in our games have been very important. Under the Big Top was one of the first times we kind of combined virtual and physical. So there were some locks and codes that they utilized on a computer, but the rest of them were still physical. Their hands were manipulating things, working locks, unlocking things, sliding things across codes and ciphers. How could we kind of facilitate that manipulation that we wanted students to do so that it was more than just passive and sitting? How to build the technical structures using LibGuides and LibWizards. How did we want it laid out? How did we want it designed? Did we want to kind of switch this to a more linear format or try to keep it a little more organic? And then of course there's the adapting the face-to-face assessment techniques to measure our game learning as well as the virtual delivery. In our physical games, what we call the reflection period has been vital to us connecting with the students and kind of connecting some of those dots for them. Yes, we have given them an assessment sheet where they answer some questions, fill in the blank, kind of short answer. But that period where they're just having a conversation with us is where a whole lot of light bulb moments have gone off. And it's the kind of moments where you literally see their brains make that connection. And so the question has been, how on earth are we even going to attempt or be able to replicate this in a digital format? So we've started with Under the Big Top. As you can see, this is the very beginning of our shell. And one of the things I want to really bring up is kind of the customization aspects of the LibGuide and SpringShare platform. And this to us is very, very important because, as Autumn said, that full immersion is something that really caught the students' attention. They loved the fact that they were kind of immersed into these themes. These games offer kind of an escape to your students from the library, from the real world. For that hour that they're in there in that game, they were in the swamp. They were in the Okefenokee discovering things. They were at the circus, you know, working from act to act, or they were in the professor's lab for the Frankenstein. This is one area where we have really, and our administration has been okay with it. They don't look like our guides necessarily. We changed the colors, we changed the tab colors, we changed the fonts, we changed some of the layout. We really want these guides to kind of bleed the theme and the story of whatever event the students are getting into. We do have some of the different tabs up. We're going to use some images to show them what kind of code, clue, or answer they might be looking for. With LibGuides, of course, you can embed those videos. You can create images, Google Forms, as Autumn said. So that's some of the way they can get some of the hand-on manipulating. LibWizard has some great tutorial sections where you can have drop-down boxes, check boxes, matching things that you match one concept with another. So you can create a whole lot of these kind of manipulative type codes and clues to go along with your story. The great thing with it being in our LibGuides platform is that we can also link out or bounce to another LibGuide. One of those more traditional LibGuides where they would kind of just gather some of that library information, search the catalog, search the database, search through an archive. And you'll see that a little later with one of Autumn's examples. We have found that that organic kind of jumping from clue to clue and not necessarily going linear is very beneficial to our students. It seems to cater to their variety of learning styles. It also kind of cuts down on any frustration moments because if they can't figure this one particular clue out right now, they can always move on to another one, maybe figure it out faster. Often something they do in figuring out that other clue gives them some insight on what to do with the clue they couldn't figure out. So we really kind of want that aspect where they can bounce around, and if they're struggling at all, they can simply leave that one and go to another tab or another ring in this case and work on another one. So where are we? We've designed the basic shell and the frame for it. We're reworking some of the clues to not quite be as physical or use some of those physical components that they did in the face-to-face game, trying to recreate that entirely virtually. And of course, lots of conversations. Will this work? How does this look? If we do this, take a quick jab at this. What do you think about this? Where we want to be. Obviously, at this time, we were hoping we were ready to roll this out with some marketing and some targeting to some specific classes with our first sets of students going through. The work that COVID introduced in reopening our libraries was a lot more than any of us actually anticipated. And ultimately, our goal is to include students in this game in particular and get them helping us kind of redesigning it for the next groups to go through, so that it's stronger and has that kind of student perspective and buy-in.
So I've had the lovely task of creating a new virtual game. Nikki is, of course, building out some momentum of working with teaching faculty who incorporate ethics as a component of their course. But the games that I've largely helped organize, again with Nikki's help, have largely been temporary, meant to celebrate month-long observances like Georgia Archives Month, and then I also worked in the Frankenstein game. So since we're a new year, there is this expectation that there's going to be a new game. So creating a virtual instructional program followed, of course, many of the same steps that Nikki had outlined, as well as many of the same steps our physical face-to-face instructional programs had developed over the years. And that involved designing the virtual game utilizing the same face-to-face strategies, but then building those technical structures in a platform like LibGuides, LibWizards, enhancing that virtual platform to ensure game immersion, and then ending with adapting face-to-face assessment techniques to measure game learning, as well as virtual delivery. Again, very similar to Nikki's experience adapting a game. So designing a virtual game from scratch, again, we use the same face-to-face structure. And we kind of identified these in our previous iterations as the 4 central tasks we had to do in order to create our instructional game. As Nikki mentioned, it always starts with a story. We had to identify a central storyline or theme that would really carry the game and our learners through. Last semester, we did the secret sources and swamps. So it was all built around the Okefenokee Swamp and our Cornell trained naturalists who studied there in the 40s. That was based off a real experience working with patrons who are using his collections and our archival collections in our care. Same way this year, our story was inspired by a real world research scenario. Those of you who might be in the university system may know that there's been an advisory group created in the university system to review the names used for buildings on campus. Since that was announced, there have been history classes and some other disciplinary faculty who are really interested in the history and legacy of those that our buildings are named after. So our story revolves around our institutional history, our buildings, and those that they're named after. So once you have a central story, of course, you have to provide your participant with a task. And this is, again, most easily accomplished by situating them in the middle of the research process. So like I just described, they're going to be situated in the middle of this process as if they were part of this advisory group, needing to find more information about the buildings and those that they're named after. You then have to, of course, design on a game design, whether it's going to be linear or non-linear. Ours is going to be kind of a combination of the two, as you will see. And to build that game, you have to identify, of course, your specific learning outcomes you hope your participants achieve. And we generally start that by identifying 5 to 6 puzzles that are built around the ACRL, the SAA, primary source literacy outcomes. From there, we will sketch out a game map in the form of a hierarchical chart that can keep the game design and the individual puzzles organized. So as you can see in the next slide, that is an example of that game chart that we used last year. As you can see that there were 5 main puzzles that users can complete in a nonlinear format, but they needed to complete all 5 puzzles. Whether it was finding a clue, a cipher, or whatnot, they had to solve all 5 of those puzzles in order to solve the 6th and final clue. And our game this year is going to follow a similar process. So tasks, again, will be designed to engage learning objects that explore primary source conceptualization, discovery, and interpretation. So adopting a similar strategy as our face-to-face game has greatly expedited the game design process. Again, as Nikki has mentioned, there's been a lot of things that have popped up over the past couple of weeks and months when we initially planned this presentation. But what took us months last year, and that time has simply taken us weeks because we've had this structure involved. Now, one of the things our 4 steps and our beautiful chart failed to acknowledge was really the immersiveness. And again, I'm sharing quotes from some of those open-ended feedback we received from participants. But the immersion of our instructional escape rooms really is what stood out to our students and to our faculty who engaged with us. And they were overwhelmingly generous. They all commented on the fact that it was hands-on, that it was a tactile experience. They loved the sound, they loved the smells, they loved the noise. So we really needed to be able to bring that into a virtual environment, particularly with the Georgia Archives Month, because it was such a sounding success. So what we've decided to do is create a semi-virtual escape game. So this year we plan to build on last year's success a little bit while accommodating the need for social distancing by offering welcome box kits. So these box kits will be filled with different clues and physical surrogates of archival materials. Participants will use these clues along to solve a series of puzzles through our virtual escape game portal. Box kits will be considered one-time use only to ensure the safety of all participants during the COVID period. So contents can include high-quality photographs, oversized color surrogates. It can also include immersive props like notebooks, a blacklight keychain, a magnifying glass. We have received a small grant to kind of build these kits out. And we adopted that by using, as you see here, a commercial mystery subscription experience that Nikki and I went through. So there will be a physical element to this game. Building the technical structures. So the program will actually involve 2 LibGuides. There'll be a Georgia Archives Month program LibGuide, which will include information about the celebratory month, the collections that we plan to use, information about special collections research, and a direct link to the game. So featured here is last year's finished product where users, participants, faculty, and staff can all learn more about the collections we are highlighting and why we were selecting those particular collections to include. There will be a separate LibGuide. Again, that will be highly customized. That will actually be the game. So individual game puzzles will be created using LibGuide's pages, or tabs, with content clues related to either archival resources or the research process in the individual boxes. Solutions to puzzles will be submitted using a media or widget box, which will correspond to a fixed choice quiz created using a LibWizard or a Google Form widget. And so here's how we've outlined how the semi-virtual gameplay process will work. Patrons will first be directed to examine, again, the high-quality archival surrogates that we've made available to them in their welcome box kits. They will then use those physical resources and compare them to digital clues and puzzles that are available to them on the LibGuide, whether it's in the form of other digitized resources, whether it's notes from a researcher or an administrator, a video, an audio clue. They will then need to examine the digital lock mechanism needed to solve the clue. For example, pictured here, I have a 5-letter clue. So that's a good indicator to the participant that they need to have a 5-letter word in order to solve that particular puzzle. After successfully opening one of the locks, the patron is rewarded with a coded clue to help solve the final puzzle. And of course, patrons will need to collect all 6 coded clues in order to retrieve the final cipher and solve the final clue, completing the overall game task. So again, like Nikki, we've been held back by a lot of the challenges during the COVID period, but where we are now, we have finished finalizing our storyline, many of our puzzle tasks, and we've identified both primary and secondary resources that we are including in the game, both as the physical welcome box kits, as well as those that we have digitized and included on the virtual platform. We are building the technical structures, those pages, those boxes in that LibGuide game platform. And we are currently going to be working on assembling those box kits. Our plans right now are to assemble about 50 of them to see how it goes. So we're currently all working on that. What we still have yet to do, again, we're preparing for an October 12th launch to coincide with Georgia Archives Month, so middle of the month. So before that has to happen, we're hoping that we can secure faculty buy-in. Faculty buy-in was really important with our face-to-face game, whether a class was requiring it as part of the curriculum or offering it as extra credit. We did offer some test run-throughs with faculty, and we found that process really informative in previous iterations of our games, so we plan to do the same. And then we also need to consider our assessment exercises. As Nikki mentioned, we do plan to do some of those fixed choice, LibWizard quiz and surveys, but we want to be sure that we're engaging the efficacy of the virtual format. Our students learning just as well as if it was a face-to-face game. And so that still poses a bit of a challenge of how we can measure that in a meaningful way without overwhelming the participants who are engaging in our instructional programs.
So that is where we are, and we thank you very much for joining us and open the floor to any questions or comments you may have.
And I'll just say that there have not been any comments in the chat so far, but again, if you have a question, please do add it to the chat and we'll read them out loud.
So the plan is we are still in the shell design stage of building our escape rooms. And speaking for the Georgia Archives Month, that probably is not going to be finished for another couple of weeks. But I believe the plan is to share this presentation with you all. So what we'll do is we'll include a link to a Dropbox where we will drop all the links in. So when they become available, we will add them there so you can access all of our behind the scenes planning documents as well as just the games. But because of everything COVID.
Yeah, the ones that are already created that we made examples of, there are links to those already built into the presentation. So once we share that, you'll simply click on the image that is on that particular slide and it should take you directly to that particular game, such as the Hogwarts game or the others.
Yes, so I'm very appreciative of Nikki for her Christmas present because she bought me the Hunt a Killer commercial subscription game, which you see kind of featured there. It was a semi-virtual, kind of expensive experience, but was really great. And the hands-on tactility of working with the different clues made the experience of solving the digital puzzles a lot more interesting for me as a participant. So I thought, why not apply some of those strategies to something the library is doing? And again, most of the materials that we're going to include in these welcome kits are going to be paper-based. So the largest expense are going to be printing, which is pretty reasonable considering how much our physical face-to-face programs usually end up costing the library, with or without, you know, a little bit of grant funding. Yeah, so including, obviously I'm the special collections librarian and we're not known for a lot of fun and games in the archives. We're known, you know, for white gloves and really protecting our resources, which of course we want to do. But I think one of the things that students, our 129 students that participated last year realized is that the archives are for them. They're meant to be used. They're meant to be used by researchers. So really getting them in the faces and in the hands of our community, our entire campus community, is really kind of the push, the drive to do a lot of these things.
And the collection we highlighted with that one last year really lent itself to including the STEM students in a way that I think they're normally not included. And as if you work with your scientific folks at all on a university setting, you know that it could be very, very difficult to convince them that there's anything in something like special collections or the archives that would be of use to them. But this was a great way to introduce archival primary sources that are still being utilized by current scientific researchers today. So it was just a fantastic collaborative opportunity.
I think it always helps to work with someone who is not in your traditional disciplinary area. I'm more humanities, I'm more working with the history folks, Nikki is with the natural sciences. So we can kind of bring things to our face-to-face and virtual programming that can appeal to both of our different audiences. So I highly recommend that approach to instructional programs as well.
Any further questions or comments? I think we'd all like to thank our presenters, Nikki and Autumn, for this very interesting presentation. And thanks to everyone who made it into the Zoom session. And again, this has been recorded, and so GLA will get the links out to everyone who needs them, and the presentation materials as well. I don't know how, but I'm sure that will happen. So I'm just going to let you all bask in the thank yous that are coming through the chat, and I will just make sure there's nothing else, and then I can stop the recording.
And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.